Greetings and welcome to this WTO webinar on delivering technologies and vaccines to end users. I am Josefita Pardo de Leon and I work at the Intellectual Property, Government Procurement and Competition Division of the WTO Secretariat. This is the third webinar that is taking place in the framework of the virtual course on trade and public health. The virtual course is running from the 3rd of May to 11th June, and as with past workshops on trade and public health, it is organized in close collaboration with our colleagues from the World Health Organization and the World Intellectual Property Organization. The content of the course is based on the second edition of the trilateral study on promoting access to medical technologies and innovation, issued in the summer of 2020. Over the last 15 years, the trilateral cooperation between WHO, WIPO, and the WTO, and our technical assistance activities on trade and public health have nurtured a holistic approach to exploring and understanding the relation between these important and mutually supportive policy areas. Engagement with experts across regions has been instrumental to foster dialogue and fruitful exchanges. This year, the traditional face-to-face global workshop on trade and public health evolved into a virtual course, and our panel discussions have morphed into the webinar series. The overall objective of this series of webinars has been to foster interactive, multidisciplinary, and informed discussions on contemporary issues related to trade and public health, as well as exploring mutually supportive approaches to policy making. During the last 2 weeks, we have had interesting discussions during the webinars on diffusion of health technologies and on access to medical technologies. The links to the videos are available on the WTO web pages of both webinars, and we invite you to check them out. The common thread running through these discussions in the webinars has been the need to strengthen international cooperation. Contributors to webinars have concurred on the need to foster a holistic approach to address public health challenges and to find practical solutions based on cooperation and goodwill from stakeholders at the global, regional, and national levels. Today, we're going to focus on the trade dimension in its most tangible expression, delivering medical technologies and vaccines to end users. As WTO Director General Okonjo-Iweala stated at the G20 Global Health Summit last Friday, trade has been a force for good in the pandemic by enabling access to much-needed medical supplies. The COVID-19 pandemic has posed unprecedented challenges for all stakeholders around the world, and it has also provided unique learning opportunities for the future. This webinar is designed to look at the developments on trade in goods and services, first from a general perspective, and then getting more focused to the end-mile delivery of medical technologies and vaccines. I would like to sincerely thank our speakers for taking time from their busy agendas to join us today. They are recognized experts, and their daily work relates to the trade dimension and delivery of medical technologies and vaccines to end users. I am honored to moderate this discussion. Let me introduce them. Mr. Simon Neumüller, he is an Economic Affairs Officer in the Market Access Division of the WTO Secretariat. Ms. Rosie Zhang, she's a counselor in the Trade and Services and Investment Division of the WTO Secretariat. Mr. Roy Santana, counselor in the Market Access Division of the WTO Secretariat. Mr. Carlos Grau-Tanner, he's the General Director of the Global Express Association. Mr. Joe Beck, Vice President, Global Distribution, Logistics and Network at Medtronic. And Dr. Ravi Prakash Mathur, Vice President and Global Head of Logistics and Supply Chain Excellence at Dr. Reddy's Laboratories. We have built in some time for discussion and comments at the end of this webinar. Please send us your questions and comments using the Zoom Q&A function, and we will direct them to the speakers. Let's turn now to the first session of this webinar, where Simon Neumüller, Rosie Zhang, and Roy Santana will provide an overview of developments and challenges faced in trading goods and services during the pandemic and the lessons that we have learned. Simon, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Josefita. There seems to be a problem with me sharing the video. I think the host stopped it. If you can give me the video, I will start sharing my screen in the meantime.
Your video is coming, Simon, in a moment.
Okay, great. Should be there. I'm trying to share my screen. Give me a second.
We can see the background of the WTO cafeteria, but we couldn't see you.
Sorry. Wrong camera. Now it should be getting there.
Now we can see you. Oh.
Okay, great. Okay, can you also see my screen now, my slides? Excellent. So thank you, Josefita, for giving me the opportunity to speak today. Let me also move. Sorry, is this for me? Thank you, Josefita, for giving me the possibility to speak today. Let us go one step back in time and remember the beginnings in last year. There were people that said, it's just a flu. Oh no, this seems serious. We need masks, many masks. We need them fast. Let's make it easy to get them in and make sure they don't get out anymore. This is how it all started last year. And this is what the presentation will be about. So in the next 10 minutes, I will show you that since the COVID-19 pandemic began, we will talk about trade that decreased in 2020, while trade in medical goods actually increased. To fight the pandemic, countries implemented measures to, at the one hand, restrict exports of critical products, and at the other hand, enacted facilitating measures that aimed at making it easier to import these products. I will show you what these measures are in a bit in more detail. Finally, we will put this all in context of the WTO framework with respect to what are the rules and what are the requirements for transparency. Let's get started. A team at the WTO has analyzed how overall trade evolved in the first half of 2020 compared to the first half of 2019. With many industrial sites being shut or with reduced production at the time, overall trade fell by a staggering 14%. However, trade in medical goods increased by a phenomenal 16% in the same period. A more recent study, which will be published shortly, showed that overall goods trade improved in the second half of 2020. Annual trade was nonetheless still reduced by more than 7% for the full year of 2020. When looking at annual data, medical goods trade continued to grow at 16% also in the second half. Interestingly, interdependencies can be observed in medical goods trade. The largest exporters are also the largest importers in goods critical to combating COVID-19. Trade in these products is contrary to popular belief, not a one-way street. In order to function, global value chains depend on trade flowing in both directions. For example, raw materials for face masks, so-called melt-blown fabric, is in many cases exported from, say, Japan or Germany to China to then produce the final face masks that will then be shipped back to these and on to other countries. Let me also mention one potential pitfall when measuring trade in goods related to COVID-19. For example, vaccines imported or exported are often simply recorded as vaccines. That's what they are. Hence, knowing the precise amount of vaccines against COVID-19 becomes, in many cases, a daring task. As a result, some WTO members have created their own statistical methodologies to capture trade in COVID-19 specific goods more precisely. But this is not the case with all WTO members. Let's take one more look at how these effects of COVID-19 started to show on trade and what kinds of measures countries took to respond. We can call it for now the triple whammy effect on world trade. Yes, panic. Higher demand for products we all thought were abundantly available led to empty shelves. As a result, especially in March and April 2020, many countries adopted export bans, restrictions, quotas, licenses, and other measures, you name it. Closed factories, lags in shipping due to less personnel, and strict hygiene measures led to higher costs and increased delivery times. To somewhat lessen these effects, many different kinds of measures have been introduced to try to lower these costs, reduce time, and facilitate trade. Most often, these measures focused on imports. And finally, the disruption of global transport services. Even when you managed to find a supplier, it was often difficult to transport the goods. With civilian aircraft being grounded to large extents, the only solution remained to get goods quickly was in quite a few cases to charter planes. So was this the perfect storm for global supply chains? Let's look a bit in more detail about these different measures. The first two on the export restrictions and the facilitating measures. We will hear about the others later from the other speakers. So with respect to export restrictions, in principle, under GATT Article 11, all quantitative restrictions under which export restrictions, generally speaking, fall, are prohibited. So countries cannot have them. They're simply not allowed. But they can be allowed if they're justified under a specific exception, such as the GATT Articles 11.2 or the general exceptions of Article 20. Export restrictions in relation to COVID-19 are most often citing GATT Article 11.2a and GATT Article 20b. The WTO recently released a note on notified export restrictions. The link can be seen here. And in this note, we focus on those export restrictions and also on trade facilitating measures. Up to today, around 1/3 of WTO members notified some form of export restricting measures in relation to COVID-19. This can range from a simple export license requirement to a full export ban. These measures are almost always designed to be temporary in nature, despite often lacking a clear timeline of implementation, which is the case for 50% of these measures. This chart shows you how many members have a measure according to each product category. Non-surprisingly, the highest number of members with export restricting measures relates to personal protective equipment, such as face masks, protective garments, and gloves. This was the kind of equipment with the highest shortages in the beginning of the pandemic last year. Other notified restricted product categories are sanitizers, disinfectants, pharmaceuticals, but also food items and even toilet paper. Up to now, only 3 members notified export measures in relation to vaccines. Let's now take a look at the trade facilitating measures. What do we mean by this? It means to make it easier to import, export, or transit. However, this does not necessarily mean that these measures are covered by the agreement on trade facilitation. Those measures are generally much broader. In fact, the majority of notified measures, that is 2/3, are tax-related measures, the blue area in the chart, aiming to both reduce the price of products that were considered to be essential to combat the COVID-19 pandemic and a desire to provide liquidity and improve the cash flow of traders who were disproportionately impacted in March and April last year. These tax-related measures were mostly related to the elimination, suspension, or waiver of tariffs, a bit more than 1/3 of all these measures. followed by the elimination, suspension of other internal taxes, fees, or charges. The second major category of measures relates to different types of customs procedures, the yellow area of the chart, including expedited or simplified clearance procedures, mostly for essential products, as well as the simplification of other customs procedures. It is here that many measures, but not all of them, seem to relate to provisions covered by the Trade Facilitation Agreement. There's finally a third category, the pink area on the chart, and they include other measures, such as the establishment for procedures for donated goods in a state of emergency. Transparency is even more important in times of crisis. There are different types of transparency obligations at the WTO that are either related to publication, to notifications, or to inquiry points, for example. I only gave you now a very brief glimpse of the full picture that we have available of how trade measures in relation to COVID-19 are dealt with at the WTO. There are many more committees and initiatives that deal with these measures. You can learn more about all of this work on the WTO's COVID-19 specific webpage. Just to give you an idea of the broader picture, there have been a significant amount of notifications submitted in relation to technical barriers to trade and to sanitary and phytosanitary measures. In addition, we have now talked about other export restrictions that get notified as quantitative restrictions. Other notifications include domestic support measures on agriculture and agricultural export restrictions. Despite these notification requirements, members have provided more information, in particular on trade facilitating measures. However, not always all information is notified for more transparency. Some measures are, for example, part of the WTO's trade monitoring report, but a formal notification with more detailed and complete information has not been provided by members. Let me wrap up now. We can say that COVID-19 led to a reduction in world trade, but medical goods trade increased. Economies are interdependent in the provision of critical goods to fight the pandemic. Countries adopted measures to, at the one hand, restrict exports, and on the other hand, facilitate trade. The measures get in principle notified to the WTO for transparency and to show that they're not violating WTO rules, but not all of them are. Now that we know how goods trade was affected in the beginning of the pandemic, let's now take a look how services were affected. So with this, I'd like to end and give the floor to my colleague, Rosie. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. Rosie, the floor is yours. Rosie, I think you're muted. Rosie, we can't hear you. It seems you are muted. Can you please try again to see if we can hear you? Your screen shows us muted.
Try logging out and back in.
Rosie, we can't hear you even when the screen shows you as unmuted. Would you like to try to log out and log in again to see if it works better? And we can, in the meantime, see if Roy would be available. Roy, would you be available to do your presentation while we solve the audio issues with Rosie?
Yeah. It went very well when we were practicing.
Thank you.
Let me just 1 second to share my screen. Now you should be able to see it. So What I'm going to be talking to you now is not about the trade or the goods aspect, it's more about the vaccines in general, and then how trade fits into the overall picture. So if you are like me, you are in this situation where you're basically waiting for your turn to get vaccinated, right? So we're all excited, we're all queuing, and then whenever we are vaccinated, we're actually sharing pictures in social media. But then the question is, what happens for those vaccines to be able to arrive to where you are? And then what I'm going to be explaining to you now is the role of international trade all over the place up to the moment in which that vaccine goes to you. And then you are going to be surprised. You are probably thinking about this international distribution. Oh, my vaccine is coming from China, or my vaccine is coming from Russia or from Europe or the United States or somewhere else. But then the question is, what happened even before that, right? So I'm going to be trying to explain to you how international trade has been important, not only for the last stage, which is you receiving the vaccine, but also for the development, for the approval, for the manufacturing, and so on and so forth. But because we have little time, I'm really going to be focusing mostly on the manufacturing onward. However, I want to say a quick word in terms of the vaccine development. Just think of this. This is a global effort where basically laboratories are gathering information from all over the place. This typically requires also getting samples. So imagine you need to move samples from, I don't know, Brazil or India into South Africa or Europe or the United States. Then, of course, international trade rules are also relevant for that vaccine development aspect. You also have the intellectual property aspects and so on and so forth. We are not going to discuss them because you have other sessions dealing with that. Another thing I would like to say before beginning is that we have produced, and then you're going to see that my slides look very beautiful. This is because I'm actually taking most of the information from publications we produced for last year. So we have 3 publications that deal with this issue. So in the slides, when you receive them, you're going to have the links to be able to download them as well. So let's begin by the vaccine manufacturing. Again, if you are like me, you have been reading the news and you are experts in the thousands of different inputs and different, let's say, medical type of materials that you need to produce vaccines, right? So you need not only the active ingredients, you also need all sorts of plastic bags and clips and bioreactors and different types of machines, laboratory type of analysis, and so on and so forth. And once it's finalized, it has to be put in a flask, it has to be put in boxes, and so on and so forth, right? So all of this requires a huge number. In some calculations, you have up to 2,000 different elements that may be required to produce a vaccine. And then you need to source them. You need all this to go into the right moment, into the right place to be able to manufacture the vaccines. And then no single country in the world is able to produce entirely one of the vaccines by their own. Typically, they need to source many of these raw materials or inputs or machines or something else to be able to produce them, right? So you have this effect that Simon was explaining, where you basically need to be able to import many of these raw materials and imports to be able to produce the vaccines. If you fail with one of them, it may be that your whole production is stopped. If I can give you one example, one discussion we keep hearing, one example is that some manufacturers at some point were having problems because they were not being able to get some plastic bags that are used in some of these bioreactors. And the fact that you don't have the bags then completely stops your production, right? So here it becomes evident that international trade is incredibly important for the manufacturing process as well. Now, there is also the issue of quality controls. We want to get vaccines, but not just any vaccine. We want the real vaccine, and a vaccine which is effective, that is able to prevent disease. So the big amount of the time in terms of the manufacturing process has to do with this testing quality type of controls. There are standards, there are different practices, and then we have the agreement on technical barriers to trade that deals with many of the aspects dealing with this type of quality controls. If I can give you another example, sometimes you have production taking place in one country, and then the quality controls are taking place in another country. So it is necessary to bring samples of these vaccines to these quality control centers, where the manufacturer wants to make sure that they are really up to the standard, up to the quality, before they authorize the release of the lot of these different vaccines. Now, there is also a big important component that has to do with the domestic approval to allow these vaccines to be released either in the country or to be exported. I'm not going to be addressing this issue in detail, just to say that, of course, this is one of the most important aspects from the regulatory point of view. If the vaccine is not approved for use, of course, it doesn't matter if you produce 1 billion of them, they cannot be used. There is also an element that has to do with who buys these vaccines, the procurement. And this changes quite a lot depending on each of the countries. In some countries, it's the governments making directly purchasing these type of products. In others, you have private actors that are able to purchase the vaccines, and then they are able to import them. And then you also have the COVAX facility, which is basically an arrangement that allows to collect, purchase, and distribute the COVID vaccines to some of the poorest countries that need them. Now, when it comes to procurement, especially when it comes to the public, there are some WTO members that have to comply with specific rules we have in terms of the government procurement agreement, which is a plurilateral agreement. This means that the rules in here apply not to all WTO members, but only to some of these members. And again, when it comes to procurement, they may have specific rules, specific requirements, approvals that have to be taken into account for purposes of trade to be able to happen. Okay, now all of this went perfectly. We had all the bags, we had all the active ingredients, we were able to get the flask, the boxes, everything. We have perfect vaccines that are produced, and then we have them in a warehouse. And here is when, and I guess this is what Rosie was going to be talking at some point as well, where the distribution chains, international transport plays a critical role to be able to deliver these vaccines. And I think Carlos is also going to be explaining and giving examples on this specific issue. One aspect I would like to highlight here is that the products or the vaccines typically do not go directly from one country to the other. Typically, they have to transit in another country. Imagine if you are, for example, exporting vaccines, let's say from China, and you want to send them to Uganda, for example. It may be that the vaccines first have to go through some regional distribution centers. For example, it may be that it has to go through Singapore, or it has to go through Kenya at some point as well before it actually arrives to Uganda. So of course, all the transit procedures which are applied by customs of these different countries may have a big impact in terms of when you're able to get these products. Another element I forgot to mention here is we realized at some point that many of these vaccines require special storage conditions. So you require specialized containers, some of which need to be at very, very cold temperatures to be able to move the vaccines, right? So you need to be able to take account of these special containers to be able to move them and have this international distribution. Some of them are disposable. Some others are using reusable type of containers. So when it comes to the containers, we also have specialized rules that deal with the temporary admission of these specific tools to be able to move the vaccines. And here, one of the key aspects that is important throughout the whole procedure is to maintain the cold chain integrity, because you just need one person making a mistake in the warehouse while transit or when the product arrives, and then the whole lot may actually be damaged, and then you are not able to use those precious vaccines. Now, how many flights? And I'm sure Carlos is going to be giving you more updated information. This is an estimate we had from the year 2020, September of last year, that was done by McKinsey and DHL. and they estimated that you would need approximately 50,000 flights and 15 million deliveries in cooling boxes or these specialized containers to be able to deliver all the vaccines which are required around the world. This implies also something like 200,000 movement by pallets and shippers, and at the time, the estimate was something like 10 billion doses of these vaccines to be able to vaccinate enough people to achieve herd immunity. So I'm sure you're familiar with all this terminology, and the numbers, I think, have been moving. It may be different today. Now, these vaccines, they were in the warehouse, they went into transit, then they finally arrived into the country, and this is the moment where our colleagues from customs and other border agency authorities come into place, because they need to make sure that all the procedures have been complied. And there are plenty of border agencies that may be involved. Depending on the country, you may have up to 30 different agencies that may be able to stop this importation for some reason. And then Simon already mentioned that in many of the countries, there was a lot of emphasis put in terms of facilitating the importation of these essential goods to combat COVID-19, and vaccines is one classical example of these simplified and facilitated procedures that have been put into place. There's also the issue of payment of the duties and all that. I'm not going to elaborate because Simon already explained some of this. Again, controls, inspections are critical at this point, because you want to make sure that the vaccines you are receiving are in good condition. And only after all the procedures have been approved, you are able actually to release the goods so they can go to the last mile distribution inside the country. Even here, you have rules that may apply. One concern, for example, has been in terms of substandard or falsified or counterfeit type of products. So there are rules that allow the companies and the governments to try to tackle this specific issue. And a last comment in terms of the coolers or containers specialized that I was mentioning before. Of course, if they are reusable, it is very important, actually critical, to be able to send these back as quickly as possible back to the manufacturer so they can actually be reused again to export even more vaccines. So thank you very much. That's a very quick overview of the chain that you need to go through the development all the way to you get the vaccine, and some of the trade rules that apply. Thank you, Josefita.
Thank you very much, Roy. Rosie, you're back. Good to see you.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you very well. Thank you very much for logging back in. So the floor is yours, Rosie.
Let me share my screen.
We can hear you. Go ahead.
Why I can. Okay, thank you, Josefita. Thank you for inviting me to this webinar. At the outside, I want to indicate that the transport and delivery of medical products is highly specialized and subject to very strict regulatory requirements, and also requires very sophisticated, advanced infrastructure. And Roy just, presented how complicated the transport and delivery of vaccines. And so my presentation will not talk about the transport and logistic of medical products, because we have very distinguished speakers from industry. They are going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about, in general, trading services in the context of COVID, and then also focus on the impact on transport and the logistic services as a sector. Okay. Here is to show you that COVID pandemic has significantly affected trading services. And then to show you that this is just last year, a few months, and then so the trading services dropped significantly, almost 30% during certain months, okay? And then so as you know that trading services, represents important inputs to other economic activities, okay? And then so not just about, manufacturing, trade flow, but also supply chain. So the impact on trading services has, very profound, repercussions beyond service sectors. Okay, and then what I want to show you that is very interesting, that the impact on the impact of COVID on trading services, okay, hit not all the sectors equally, but hit those sectors that rely on the physical proximity of suppliers and the consumers, that relies on the movement of natural persons. So you see that, tourism is the sector that hit the most, okay? And then, of course, retail, live entertainment, construction services, of course, transport, and also logistics services. These are the sectors that are hit most by the pandemic, okay? And then, so this is to show you that, this is to show you that, for example, in the second quarter of 2020, this global travel exports dropped huge in many regions in the world. That's 90%, 70%, and then some countries even almost 100%. So this is a very somber picture. But then there's always a silver lining, okay, in this somber picture. And during the pandemic, business, okay, have accelerated their online operations, and also consumers have shifted to online consumption. And then so we have seen a booming of online services, okay? And in addition to work from home, we have seen the booming of telemedicine. We have seen, online education, online retail, and also, okay, because of, the massive use of online apps, okay, we have seen, this ICT service, booming of ICT services. For example, just during 1 week of March 2020, there's a record download of teleconference apps, okay, reached 62 million downloads, okay? And also we have seen the booming of mobile payment application, okay? So this is something very, interesting, and also I think that will have very profound impact for the future, because that means that, this, according to the recent study of IBM, okay, the pandemic has accelerated the shift to digital trade by 5 years, by at least 5 years. So this is a very profound implications. Okay. And then this is to show you that, this export of ICT services during the pandemic. Okay, just Q1, we have seen the growth in most of the regions on the planet, and then there's the following quarters we have seen further growth. Okay. So this is the general picture of the impact on trading services. Now let's take a closer look at the impact on transport and logistics services. Transport and logistics services, they are the essential for trading goods, for supply chains. But then we have seen significant disruptions, during the pandemic. The measures adopted by governments, the lockdowns, quarantine, border closures, okay, all this, and also, heightened inspection of goods, even at the borders. All this have, created disruptions, bottlenecks to transport. For example, most of the passenger crafts have been grounded. which shrink the cargo capacity, okay, because the belly of passenger crafts represents 50% of air cargo capacity, okay. And then so now since the capacity has reduced, it cannot meet the increasing demand. So we have seen significant increase of freight rates, okay. And then on road transport, almost in all the regions on the planet, we have seen long waiting time at the border crossings, and because transport operators, most of them, they are small and medium enterprises, and then so because of that, they are facing financial losses because the prolonged transport time and also sudden reduced demand. All the disruptions actually generated a bankruptcy problem in the industry. And then in maritime transport, of course, we are familiar with that. We have seen port congestion and the shortage of empty containers, delay of shipment, lack of seafarers, okay? And also we have seen a significant increase of freight rates, okay? And so all these disruptions will definitely impact the economy as a whole, okay? But of course, it's also like in other sectors, we also have seen digitalization accelerated in transport and logistics services. A lot of companies have reported that. And then there's a very interesting saying that, before the pandemic, digitalization was considered as a vitamin, okay? Of course, if you digitalize your supply chain, it's fine. It will make you more healthy. But then since the pandemic, shifting to digitalization now is considered as something, they call it a painkiller, because if you don't digitalize your supply chain, and then your competitors will run you over. So this is something that is very interesting, and also that will have very profound implications for future. Okay, so this is about digitalization in transport and logistics services. And then the measures, okay, measures adopted by members during pandemic, like in goods trade, there are two types of measures. One type of measures, they are restrictive measures, lockdown, border closure, quarantine, in tightened inspection, okay? They have created significant disruptions, okay? They are not sort of adopted, particularly targeting transport or logistics, but then they created significant disruptions in air, maritime, and land transport, and also they have severe repercussions on goods trade and the supply chains. And then, of course, governments, they also adopt measures to mitigate COVID impact. Something like, they relax regulatory requirements on transport, and then provide financing to transport operators, okay, or directly finance shipment of medical equipment and medical protective products. Okay, for example, the EU has established this program to provide funding to finance cargo shipment, at the EU level. So these are all the typical measures adopted during pandemic, affecting transport and logistics services. Very briefly, what we have learned, okay? So I think this pandemic has further underscored the broader infrastructure role of financial, transport, distribution, logistics services in facilitating goods trade and also economic growth, okay? And then I think because of these disruptions, significant disruptions to supply chains, one important lesson is that we need to establish is emergency response mechanism to allow for early warning and proactive and or even predictive actions. especially when implementing measures to contain pandemic, try to avoid introducing obstacles to transport and logistics services, and then allow the movement of key or essential workers, for example, crews, seafarers, and the drivers. Unfortunately, I think so far, we haven't solved this problem because, for example, recently, due to the second wave of pandemic in India and some other South Asian countries, many port authorities in the world, they have prohibited crew change for vessels which have recently arrived or transit ports in India, in Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, or Pakistan. And then, so that actually worsened the prices of seafarer and also worsens the bottleneck in maritime shipping. Okay, so because these South Asian countries, they are the main suppliers of seafarers. So I think we are still in the crisis, and then still try to find a way how to solve the problem. You have to really find a way, try to ensure the supply chain and trade flow, but at the same time, of course, try to control the pandemic. And then another lesson is that, of course, international cooperation, try to coordinate and finance the delivery. This is something that some regions' government, they have already established mechanism, try to coordinate. For example, in European Union, they try to coordinate the measures at the European Union level, because at the early stage of the pandemic, there was chaos because of the closing borders and different measures, and now they try to coordinate at the EU level. But then at the global level, we are still far away from that. Okay, and then another, of course, important lesson is how to build the resilience of supply chains. Okay. This, in the past, we used to highlight this just-in-time delivery, okay, and the linear inventory and all this, criteria. But then this pandemic shows that resilience probably as important, if it's not more important, at least is as important as efficiency of supply chain. And then so there's this is an important lesson, but how to build the resilience of supply chains, of course, is beyond this presentation. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rosie. For our second session, we're very fortunate that Carlos Grau-Tanner from the Global Express Association has agreed to share with us the experience on facilitating cross-border vaccine delivery. Carlos, you have the floor.
Thank you, Josefita, and a very good afternoon from Geneva. In fact, we are based not far away from the WTO's premises here. As I always say, we're just a few tram stops away. Thank you so much for your invitation. I'm very happy and honored to be able to give you our insight as express delivery carriers into the issue of global vaccine distribution, what the issues are and how it is going so far, and what we predict for the future. Without further ado, I'm going to test my technology skills and try and share my screen. Can you see the slides?
Can. Thank you, Carlos.
Thank you very much. So some of the previous speakers have stolen a little bit of my thunder. So some of the things you'll see here have already been addressed. I am going to try to be very brief and address from a very pragmatic, hands-on point of view, the specific issue of facilitating the cross-border delivery of COVID-19 vaccines. First, perhaps a quick introduction about our association. We are a trade association based here in Geneva that represents the three leading express delivery carriers, DHL, FedEx Express, which now includes TNT, and UPS. What is our business? What do we do? What is our role in this whole situation? Well, express delivery carriers are providers of sophisticated logistics services to clients of all sizes, people and corporations, from micro and small enterprises to very large multinationals who want to ship goods or documents from one doorstep on the planet to another one, and do so very quickly and in a very secured and controlled way. So what you see here is what happens behind the scenes. You might just see occasionally one of our drivers bringing or picking up a parcel from your location. But what happens to that parcel? What would happen, for instance, to a vaccine shipment after it's been picked up at the manufacturing site? Well, it would go on one of our ground vehicles, and the combined fleet of our three members is 250,000 ground vehicles operating around the world in 220 countries and territories. It would be brought to a local station where it would be prepared for either further ground transport to an airport, or if it isn't at an airport, it will be put into one of the 1,500 planes operated by these three companies, and then flown typically to a hub. Express delivery carriers operate worldwide networks based on a multiple hub and spoke structure. At that hub, it would be transshipped, and then the reverse process would happen at the other end, where it would be going from a plane to another plane, arrive at the city of destination, put on a ground vehicle, and delivered to the addressee. This happens, again, in a very secure environment because it stays in the hands of the express delivery carrier throughout the voyage. And it also happens in a time-definite way, meaning that you know when this shipment is going to arrive at the destination's doorstep. To give you an order of magnitude of our operations, our members collectively transport around 40 million shipments daily, and 1 million of those shipments are international shipments that cross borders. This you've seen that are the same figures that Roy showed before. This is to give you an order of magnitude of the operation, of the scale of the operation of the distribution of COVID-19 vaccines. These are estimates from one of our members in cooperation with McKinsey. DHL came up with these figures. The estimate is that this operation of global distribution of COVID-19 vaccines will take 60,000 tons of air freight, 15,000 flights, and 15 million deliveries in cool boxes in 200,000 pallets. You might say, okay, is this big? Yes, this is very big. The scale of this operation makes it quite an extraordinary operation, not only in terms of the size of it, of the numbers, but the speed with which this has to take place, and also the very specific characteristics around the transportation of some of the vaccines, particularly those that have to be transported at very, very low temperatures in the order of -70, -80 Celsius throughout the supply chain. And as Roy mentioned earlier, this is done through very sophisticated temperature control supply chains with containers, also very sophisticated containers that are designed to keep the temperature between certain parameters and monitor the temperature of the container throughout the voyage to make sure that there is no disruption in the temperature that could affect the quality of the vaccine. I couldn't agree more with previous speakers that trade is a very important component here. I won't go into the specifics, but we do believe that the success of this global vaccination campaign depends on trade lanes being open for all the reasons that previous speakers have evoked. But particularly one of the key issues here that shows you how complicated this is that manufacturing of the end product of the vaccine is concentrated in a handful of countries around the world, but it has to be distributed to 220 countries and territories or more. So that gives you also an idea of the scale of the operation that we're facing and how challenging it is. In order to prepare for that, we issued back in October what we call a checklist, a getting ready checklist for the attention of governments around the planet, saying, okay, you have to think of a number of issues to make sure that vaccines cross borders very swiftly, very efficiently. Again, these are very sensitive temperature control shipments, which need to reach the destination as quickly as possible. So there is a whole list of things you need to think about. I won't go through it in detail. It's available on our website. It's a public document. Let's focus here on a number of issues. First, the importance of avoiding bottlenecks at the border. As Roy mentioned, there is not only customs at the border, but many, many more border agencies that could have a say in stopping the importation of the vaccine. In some countries, and here I have to correct my good friend Roy, it's up to 53 agencies that can have a say in that. They need to be tightly coordinated, ideally through a single window. A single window is a system whereby the information is put in once electronically about the shipments that are coming in before they arrive, and then all the agencies can assess the eligibility of that shipment for importation and respond through a single point of contact and say, yes, we all agree that that is a green, you can come in. I must say that some governments have resorted to setting up single windows just for the purpose of importing the vaccines, and it's highly successful. Then there's also the issue of behind the border. The transportation that happens on surface vehicles, trucks, lorries, vans, inside the country. Here, that will take very, very tight coordination between all levels of government, local, federal or regional, as the case may be, and the central or federal government, to make sure that there are no hurdles for this transportation to take place between the airport where the shipments have arrived and the final destination, which might be a chemist, a hospital, or an official vaccination center. Going forward, we've also identified the need to prepare for potentially the need for new authorizations if the case is that new strains of the virus require new vaccines, and therefore they have to be submitted to new authorization processes. So we just wanted to flag this to say, think about that, get ready. So how has it been going so far? Well, the answer is very well. I think these messages have come across very, very loud and clear. We've got really very good support from international organizations such as the WTO with transparency mechanisms and all the thinking that has been going into presentations such as the one you saw from Roy, what is the entire supply chain of the vaccine production and distribution, what are the trade-related aspects, and also from the World Customs Organization about the specifics of crossing the border with the cool boxes containing the vaccines. For instance, the World Customs Organization issued a recommended classification for vaccines under their harmonized system, saying which codes should be used, and that has been adopted by a number of countries, I understand. It helps also that the first shipments of vaccines, because they were so eagerly awaited, were highly publicized events. You've all seen in the press reports about the first shipments coming into country A, country B, country C. And of course, that meant that in this case, we had top-level political support for the logistics around the importation of these vaccines. In many cases, I'm sure you've seen the pictures, we had the Prime Minister or the President on the tarmac receiving our planes with the first shipments. It also helps that in many cases, Roy evoked this in his presentation, the importer of record, as we call it, was the government itself. So the entity doing the procurement for the first shipments was the government. And of course, that helps when your client is the government itself to bring things across the border. Just a few examples to illustrate these points here on the slide. You can see, for instance, 2 tweets from the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, showing pictures of a FedEx plane or a UPS plane bringing the first shipments of vaccines into Canada. Or on the right-hand side, an example where the importer of record is the government itself. In this case, this is the first shipment of vaccines coming into Spain. And as you can see, it's wrapped with the state coat of arms and the government's logo, because it was the government itself that imported it. And this is my favorite picture of the whole operation. This is showing the arrival of the first shipment of vaccines into Malaysia. The lorry here is escorted by police out of the airport, which shows the level of support that we have received for this worldwide campaign. But a caveat, this was just the start. This is going to be a long campaign. It's probably going to take 2 years for this to roll out completely. So what we're saying is that this level of support, this fantastic top-level political support that we've seen, needs to carry on for the duration of the campaign. And also, again, back to the concept that vaccination will depend, or successful vaccination campaign will depend on open trade lanes. It's not only the vaccines that are required to deliver the jab, it's a number of ancillary products, needles, syringes, gloves, face masks, face shields, PPE, personal protection equipment, which, as Roy also mentioned, are manufactured in different countries and have to be distributed worldwide. We are working on new estimates, and one of the estimates is that if you take into account all the ancillary products that are needed for the vaccination campaign, the need for airlift is probably going to be twice as big as the one I mentioned just for the vaccines. So, going now to trading services, to Rosie's presentation. Air cargo here is going to be essential. Yes, there have been disruptions in some supply chains, but I'm happy to report that express delivery has been operating normally throughout the pandemic, and in fact is one of the essential players in delivering the distribution of vaccines. However, not everything is going as smoothly as one would want, which has prompted the World Health Organization and the International Civil Aviation Organization to remind all countries in a joint statement issued back in March that, first of all, the application of stringent public health measures to aircrew, particularly to all cargo services, just like ours, which carry no passengers, including quarantines, can result and has resulted in hindering connectivity, in operational complexity being increased, and also adding significant cost. I mean, in a cargo environment, pilots have interaction with very few people, unlike in a passenger environment. And therefore, it's relatively easier to establish a public health corridor for them. So departing from this, if, for instance, a country should impose quarantines, means that the crew cannot operate another flight in the next 24 or 48 hours, or bring the plane back if that was foreseen. And that quickly can lead to a disruption, a serious disruption in the cargo supply chain, which is what you want to avoid. The two organizations also mentioned that it's important to designate aircrew as key workers and to make sure that their movement across borders is facilitated. As I said, the imposition of quarantines or all the health measures to crew that is a lot less exposed is not a good idea in order to keep the distribution going. Lessons learned, I would agree with previous speakers that there are a number of issues related to what the WTO does that from which we can draw important lessons. First, facilitation. As I said, a number of governments have brought in really new facilitation measures for the vaccines. Governments that relied on paperwork, on stamps, on original signatures now accept scanned copies and emails where they have not put in place a real electronic communication system for data to be communicated electronically. Some have resorted to putting in place single windows just for the vaccines. But this shows that many of the measures in the trade facilitation agreement of the WTO have been implemented in full in a very aggressive and efficient way for the vaccines. And if this can be done for the vaccines, surely it can be done for everything else. So where there is a will, there is a way, and we hope that this will really illustrate the discussions on trade facilitation going forward at the WTO. Similarly, it has brought to light the importance of logistics in the distribution of vaccines and the manufacturing of vaccines. There is a lot that remains to be done in market access for logistic services under the WTO, and we encourage further discussions along those lines, because logistics is not only flying a plane into the territory. There's a number of services around that need to be packaged together. For instance, warehousing, having the ability to build your own temperature-controlled warehouses in a territory is trade-in services. Having the ability to run your own local delivery services in an integrated manner with a plane that just arrived is trade-in services. And there is ample room for improvement in the commitments taken under the GATS by WTO countries. So we hope that these lessons on trade facilitation, on trade-in services will drive the negotiations going forward in a significant way. And with that, I come to the end of my presentation, and as all the other speakers, I'll be very, very happy to take any questions at the end of the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carlos, for a very enlightening and very practical presentation. We will move now to our third session. It will be an opportunity to learn from Joe Beck.
Josefita, you're muted.
Okay, I'm sorry. Do you hear me now?
Yes, now it's working.
Okay. Well, we're going to go now to our third session, and this is an opportunity for us to learn from Joe Beck and Ravi Mathur on the successful and delivery of medical technologies and pharmaceutical products. So welcome, Joe and Ravi. Joe, you have the floor.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Get the screen going here.
Your screen is coming, but we cannot see you.
Yeah, give me just a second. All right, can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can.
And can you see me?
Now we can see you.
All right.
Perfectly.
So I think Roy and Rosie and Carlos covered a lot of ground, which was good information, but ultimately a lot of the challenges that face pharma and the vaccine supply chain ultimately impact medical devices as well. So as we jump in, a little context for who Medtronic is. We are about a $29 billion company. So we actually announce earnings tomorrow. So this is our FY20 total revenue. But we operate in about 150 countries, 4 portfolios, and or really therapies. Think of those as therapies. We've got about 50% of our revenue comes from the UPS or comes from the US, and we're rapidly growing internationally, especially in emerging markets where we're really trying to increase access to patients globally. We're a very mission-driven organization, and our goal is to alleviate pain, restore health, and extend life. And we like to say we're the world's leading medical technology and solutions company. What's similar to pharma as well, we reinvest in about $3 billion in R&D and clinical trials. And about 12.5% of our employees are healthcare professionals. So whether it's clinical scientists, engineers, et cetera. And what's really especially important to me is that we positively impact 2 people every second with our products and services. So as we provide a little more information, and this is just a quick view of the human body and the areas that we touch, but we really harness the power of technology to treat over 70 plus conditions. We provide the most advanced implantable products and work with our patient's body. So think about things to the devices that regulate the heartbeat, that stimulate the central nervous system, or replace joints. Among other functions, our products really cover a wide range of product portfolio. So think about diagnostic technologies for detecting disease, monitoring vital statistics such as our glucose level monitoring capabilities for diabetic patients, and then everything from bandages to sutures to gauze. So we're really going to focus today on our ventilator portfolio, given the impact of the pandemic, and we'll jump into that here next. So like many of us, the pandemic has become a catalyst for change. If you think about the ventilator market in particular, it hasn't been very dynamic for the past 10 plus years. Demand was relatively stable. It was plodding along with low growth and long replacement cycles. Then suddenly the pandemic hits. So the vent manufacturers all realized together that no one company can meet global demand. So we really had to think out of the box to support global demand. So not only did we increase our production 5x in a very short period of time, weeks and months, we also open sourced our design specs for our really small, compact, portable ventilator to get more access around the world. We also partnered with new suppliers, and we took a page out of the high-tech playbook to develop remote monitoring technology where we could remote up into our ventilator technology and also help train the hospital systems on how to use our products. So if you think about ventilators, they're not simple machines. They're actually quite complex. So our highest end machine actually has over 115 or 1,500 parts. We actually get that from over 100 suppliers across 14 countries. And some of those are really long lead time suppliers. So as countries began restricting imports and exports, and our global supply chain was really confronted with unprecedented challenges. It required us to work with our partners and to help continue operations and really ramp up production of critical components and ensure we had continuity of supply across the supply chain. We also partnered, similar to others on this call as we talked, we partnered with our distribution partners, our transportation partners, and our trade providers to ensure medical supplies and products could continue to reach those in need. And really our primary goal, which really became our mantra, is to keep product flowing in order to fulfill our mission. So how do we do that? And ultimately, it all for us revolves around our critical management framework. It centers around our mission, and then ultimately it focuses on engaging, enabling, empowering our people. And what we realized through multiple crises, catastrophic events over the years, whether it's hurricanes in Puerto Rico, the volcanic ash cloud situation, the many things that we've all dealt with in supply chain over the years, is that really people, when we come together, we can do anything with the right focus, the right collaboration, and ultimately commitment to a bigger cause. So what I'd like to do is maybe cover some specifics to medical device. So as I mentioned, Roy and Rosie really covered quite a few of the challenges well. I spent 15 years at UPS when Carlos was talking about the UPS network and some of the challenges and how they've had to adapt and partner with the manufacturers. It really hits home because we're dealing with that every day in med device as well. And I'd like to cover maybe some specific examples around what were Medtronic's challenges in our solutions. So I already covered some of our manufacturing efforts and then ultimately our remote monitoring capabilities. But given the need to continue manufacturing and support the manufacturing of essential products, we also had to source PPE for our distribution center employees, for our healthcare professionals, and ultimately our manufacturing sites. So what we did, we were able to source PPE from multiple parts around the world with a great ISM team that got on it very quickly. A little bit of the early bird gets the worm. And then we stood up 3 global PPE distribution centers and hubs that were able to pulse out, take orders and pulse out PPE to our employees, our sites, and our healthcare professionals. Then, secondly, we were able to quickly, as the air freight market dried up that Rosie covered well, there's as much as in some lanes a 90% drop in passenger lift globally. We immediately huddled, and within 48 hours, we had secured freight capacity with all our tier 1 partners, really the big 5 in the air freight space. And we started pulling forward 6 weeks worth of inventory to push the markets close, to push our product closest to the markets where there was customer demand. So the key strategy there was to get the product in market. So if trade shut down, we would still have product to service and take care of patients in those regions. And then we've been toggling between air and ocean freight, depending upon various market constraints that, as you know, we just covered. There's a lot of capacity that's going to vaccine tonnage. There's also normal global trade that's still transpiring. So capturing the right air freight capacity and toggling between air and ocean becomes even more important as we make smarter decisions. And then the ocean container availability has been a significant challenge, and the Suez Canal situation didn't help any of us with having an imbalance of where containers are located and availability of containers. So if we think now, we kind of turn our lens to more recently the situation of what's really going on in India. It's kind of been similar to the rest of the world. I would just tell you, at least in our experience, it's been more complicated in many ways. It's a large population, highly concentrated in population in major city clusters. And it relies primarily, because of the infrastructure, it primarily relies on air freight network that suddenly became non-existent, similar to what we experienced globally. And we had additional constraints with trucking and with the trucking network too. So what we did is we shifted to rail. So we would take from our DCs, our 3 DC node network, and we would move it rail into the major clusters, and then we would duct into the last mile delivery network to ensure we could meet patient demand. And then we also had people challenges and continue to have people challenges through this. So we've had absenteeism, not just at the employee level, but certainly across transportation, distribution, and trade. We've had several leaders that have been in and out, unfortunately, with battles with COVID. And we really had to leverage remote management, cross-regional support, supporting from various parts around the world. We've deployed our emergency response team, and we've been able to manage through that to date successfully. So let me kind of paint a picture of a day in the life of what happens to get ventilators to market. You kind of heard the challenges that happen with vaccines. Similar in our world, we have not just medical device, but we also have cold chain product with tissues and other products that we move that must move in a cold chain environment. But for vents specifically, we move vents, products and accessories in from the U.S. And Europe into India, and it requires special country labeling for the import, as covered earlier. And then we also bring in power cords that are India-specific plugs that we manufacture in China. And then we kit those vents, the accessories, the cords, paperwork, We power up the units, we load software upgrades on those machines, and then we ultimately package them for last mile delivery. And then we have to coordinate the delivery with a field engineer for installation, who unboxes it, runs diagnostic checks on it. But ultimately, our SLA is that we need to ensure proper functionality and execution within 6 hours of point of delivery at the hospital, to where we have a patient that's on that PB 560 ventilator. That's ultimately our vision of success, is to ensure 100% of the time, every time, we're up and running within 6 hours or less. And then we've actually been very fortunate. We have an outstanding regional logistics team in India. We have an outstanding global trade team that's been able to work through these issues and problem solve real time. And we're all problem solving together, because as mentioned earlier, this pandemic, and even as we get fully vaccinated, it's still here for a while as we work through that from a logistics standpoint. And then we've also had other regional challenges, especially in that market, most recently the Singapore constraints. So a very large hospital cluster clamped down pretty fast because of new COVID variants that were outbroke in a particular hospital. And that had a ripple effect across the hospital chains, as many drivers that delivered to that location in the last 3 weeks were now no longer able to deliver to other hospital chains. So we had to get creative again, working with our partners, because there's a shortage of delivery drivers all of a sudden. So we actually deployed kind of similar processes and emergency response team strategies that we do internally, or we do with our other partners. Is we leveraged office personnel, we leveraged various logistics companies where the owners and the back office staff came out and helped deliver. We pulled in drivers from Malaysia, and then we leveraged various courier solutions, because if you think about not just within Singapore, but globally, a lot of our products operate with batteries. So there's restrictions on passenger aircraft. So we have to think through how can we move those over a ground network? How can we limit what moves in the air based on restrictions, and then still get product to market and marry it up with the actual units themselves. So I mean, I could speak for a while on all the challenges across Italy, Netherlands, the rocket challenges ultimately we've had in Israel recently that have only compounded issues coming out of the Middle East, to still move keep product flowing in that market. Permits and special permit challenges in Philippines and so forth. But what I would leave everyone with is this is really the day in the life of global logistics and trade. And what's important is the World Trade Organization and all of us continue to come together collectively and leverage our intellectual capital to really help each other and help the world through these dynamic times. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to a former customer with Dr. Reddy, Ravi.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. It was a pleasure listening to your talk. I'll now share my screen. Is it visible now?
Yes. No screen yet, Ravi.
Okay, give me a second.
We can see it now, Dr. Mathur.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get it on a slideshow. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Josefita and the WTO team for inviting us here. Now, I presume I'm the last speaker here in today's forum. So my challenge now is to say all what the previous speakers have spoken about, but try to say it in a different way. That was on a lighter side. So I'll try to pick up certain elements, about both how the pandemic had affected the supply chain, and how it helped us transform the supply chain, and also a little bit about the vaccine distribution in the Indian context. So we have heard the previous speakers talk about how it moves across international borders, how the approvals come, and how the quality clearances are done. I'll take it on from there and try to take it how the national, the in-country distribution of the vaccines is being done. But before I go there, I'll take this opportunity to introduce my organization. I represent Dr. Reddy's Laboratories Limited. We are an Indian company based out of Hyderabad, headquartered in Hyderabad. And our vision is to improve life expectancy and quality of life with good science. And of course, the qualifying thing over here is it has to be affordable. So that is what drives us. And our mission is that good health can't wait. We serve more than 1 billion patients. We are present in more than 40 countries, and we have a portfolio of more than 400 products. So accelerating access to affordable medicine and innovative medicine is what is our purpose. So today I'll be taking up 3 things to talk about. One, of course, is the supply chain transformation during pandemic. And we had heard the previous speaker that how the pandemic and specifically the lockdown periods, they had disrupted the total international logistics chains. The passenger aircrafts had totally stopped. What that meant was that the belly space in those passenger aircrafts, they were taken out, and the belly space is what normally carried the cargo. So what we were left with was almost 1/3 of the overall air freight capacity internationally, and that was only through freighters, and there were many restrictions around that. There were charters which were flowing, but then charters required specific permissions, and to add to that, flights were getting cancelled, vessels were getting delayed. So how did we manage that operations during the lockdown period? And pertaining to that lockdown period, I also present a small case study where in the lockdown we were able to launch a new product into Europe. That patent had gone off, and we had to be there on day 1. And I'll conclude with some thoughts about the challenges on the vaccine distribution in a large geography like India. So first, I'll talk about how we dealt with the lockdown. Now, as we all realized that there was total disruption, there was manpower was not available, the transportation system was not there, flights were getting cancelled, and we are around a $3 billion company, so that's a fairly decent size for a company. And with that, so as you can imagine, there are many manufacturing locations, there are multiple geographies. How do you get the supply chains moving? And what we did was we took it and we got inspired by some methodologies which the manufacturing folks are pretty familiar with. This is called lean daily management. So when we look at lean management principles or tools that help us manage lean manufacturing, so lean daily management is a very systematic way that allows proper support to the processes and the activities that are involved in that. So that actually comes from a manufacturing background, but we adopted it, and we adopted it for get the continuity in the logistics. So what we did is we reduced the rate. So in a normal scenario, a supply chain is expected to work like clockwork. It has to be on an autopilot. You don't really need to have any intervention. Everything happens as per a system. Everything happens as per the defined processes and the defined procedures. But in a disrupted setup, these things, everything breaks down. So what we realized was that what we had to do, number 1, was reduce the review mechanism to a daily review. Okay, so that was your review bucket. And then we got into a process of planning, execution, monitoring, and review. So we did that every day. So what you planned for tomorrow, you reviewed, you netted off the delta, and then planned again. But the important thing was there were multiple ways you had to dice the data with, so there are multiple origins, multiple destinations, logistics, various stakeholders. The plant managers have their point of view. They want the warehouses not to be choked. If they're producing something, they expect that the warehouse, the logistics teams are able to take care of the material and they're able to ship them out immediately. Similarly, the markets expect to be served. The business units expect that you are able to make the material available so that they meet their business goals. slice it by origin, market, slice it by product categories, mode of transportation. So now, if you look at from a purely logistics perspective, if you are doing a plan, execute, monitor, review every day, so you have to do it for the length of the transportation lead time. So for example, if my lead time for ocean is 30 days, so there's for 30 days till the time the shipment has left the origin and has not been received by the customer or my warehouse at the other end, then I have to keep a track of it, because the chain was breaking down at multiple points. You might have shipped out something from your factory only to discover that it's still stuck at the airport. You might have just ensured that the product is airlifted only to realize that it is stuck at a transit airport. So unless you are reviewing and pushing everything every day, you really cannot ensure that in a lockdown or a pandemic situation, there will be no breakdown in the way you're managing your logistics. In addition to that, a couple of other things that we did, we had to increase our market connect. So for example, in a situation like that, there are many short window opportunities like they come up, like charter flights that come in with a very short notice of announcement. Okay. So unless you are present, unless you have ear on the ground, you do not know what opportunities are coming up. So your market connect helps you to identify solutions that keep on emerging. The other thing is sometimes you have to rely on new partners. You have to onboard new partners, right? But that has to be done quickly. Normally, you would go through a process of due diligence and other things related to compliance. But without compromising on those aspects, how do you fast track onboarding a new partner and ensure that you are able to use the new services and also ensure that there is compliance on all the aspects of quality and safety and other things that your organization might be wanting to drive? A strong partner network, like I said, you get early alerts. One of the earlier speakers also talked about early alerts. So early alerts is very, very critical. The other thing is cross-industry collaboration groups, support groups. You can, sometimes these could be like a WhatsApp group, or they could be some other more sophisticated digital platforms where your airlines, your shippers, your other transporters, they are able to share information, and then they make you agile. And then you have to adopt new solutions. You have to break the old ways of thinking. So fortunately now this has become a part of life, and we really do not know how long this crisis is going to continue. So this new way of working has to become ingrained with very organizations. So everybody talks about agility, but how do you get agility? You have to get agility by adopting processes that make you agile, by de-risking in a way that make you agile. So that was a part on how we dealt with the lockdowns and how we transformed our supply chain, a pharma supply chain, in the pandemic period. Now, I'll quickly take you through a case study, and it is there in the public domain. So last year, there was a product called Sinacalcet, and that was going off patent in Europe. But at that point of time, there were no regular flights going out of India. They were charters, and even the freighters, scheduled freighters, they were getting cancelled. And what happened was that the destination airport, the flight got cancelled to that. And when you in a patent regime, you really have to be very sure that you are not entering the the borders before the patent expiry happens. But at the same time, you want to be there on day one. You really cannot wait for the flights to resume. We were quickly able to identify an alternate airport. We were able to find processes in the customs that enabled us to move the shipment under bond. We were fast enough to catch the last Lufthansa freighter out of Hyderabad into Frankfurt. We expedited the quality release time. We changed the process over there, and that was the Easter break at that time. And then by the time your patent was over, we arranged the trucks were waiting, and we put the product onto the trucks, and we were there on day one. And that was the mission that we lived. We have to be there available for the patients when the medicines are required by them. So that was a little happy story where, in spite of all the challenges, our commitment to the market, our commitment to the patients. We were able to live our mission and deliver that. So that was the part of my presentation we had on the pandemic. Now I'll shift to the other part of the discussion, which is on the vaccine, and I'll pick up from where Roy left, which was having crossed the international border. So now I'll talk about how do you handle in-country distribution. So just to set the context over here, we're talking about India, so which has more than 3 million square kilometer of area. We have a demography which is 34% urban and 66% rural. And out of that, around 600 million people are there in the eligible, in age group of more than 18, which are qualified to get vaccinated. To add to that complexity, we are a union of 28 states and 8 union territories. And so how do you create a network that enables you to reach the entire length and breadth of the country? How do you ensure that the vaccine is available? So fortunately, there is a universal immunization program that the government of India runs. And so there are around 29,000 cold chain points. There are around 40,000 freezers, 44,000 odd ice-lined refrigerators. But these were consumed by the existing vaccines which are there in the program, like the oral polio vaccine and the other vaccines that are there in the system. The challenge is now, how do you estimate that and how do you upgrade that existing infrastructure to ensure that you are able to use it for these COVID-19 vaccines? As somebody had rightly pointed out earlier, these are not normal vaccines, these are cold chain vaccines. Some of them are 228 now, which is still an easier problem to solve because there are many 228 products that move through the logistics ecosystem, and there are competencies and there are processes that help deal with it. But there are other vaccines which are say -20, or there are other vaccines which are -70. So we really don't have a -70 vaccine in India right now, but yes, the vaccine that DRL is bringing to the market in India is Sputnik V, and that is a -20 vaccine. So how do you quickly upgrade our infrastructure? How do you quickly train people? How do you quickly ensure that the vaccines are available where we want them to be? And this diagram actually gives you a sense of the complexity because you require multiple warehouses, you require multiple modes, you require air transport, you require road transport. How do you put it all together? That was the puzzle that we had in front of us when we started. When we started, the only piece of information that we had is that we need to get ready to distribute the vaccine. That's it. Now, how do you start planning with that limited information? When you plan a logistics network, you need a lot more. You want to know the MOQ, you want to know the weight, you want to know the packing configuration, you need to know where the demand is coming from, you need to know where to put the warehouses. But how do you deal with an emerging information that is changing every day, with information that is emerging, as we progress in the journey? So that was a challenge, and how we became ready to deal with that. The next few slides of my presentation deal with that. So basically, we identified that irrespective of what the variables are, the parameters, they will keep on changing. There essentially will be there will be three archetypes that we'll be dealing with, and we have to plan for all the three. So the first one is a direct shipment to the point of use. Now, this could work in a small geography, a small country. But if you are trying to reach to say 40,000 vaccination center from a central warehouse, you realize the limited possibility of having that kind of an archetype, right? So it could work for areas which are near the manufacturing zone or areas which are near to the central warehouse. So I'm not saying this was ruled out. So this was one of the archetype that we have when we take care of vaccine distribution. The other one is a cross-docking mechanism. As you can see, there is a combination of a cool box, insulated box, and an active transportation solution for cold chain management, without having to touch that product. The challenge over here is you have to minimize the number of touch points. You don't want people to be in touch with the product. So how do you minimize the number of times the product has to be handled? See, as long as it is getting handled at a tertiary packing level, it is okay. But what you really do not want is somebody handling the product at a secondary packing level or at a primary packing level. So cross-docking is something that works as long as it is able to give you a disaggregation point, right? If you had the possibility, you would like to send direct, but then to take advantage of the benefits of aggregation in terms of transportation, and also the ability to disaggregate at the point where you get the maximum benefit. So cross-docking works over there. The third part, of course, is you really cannot avoid a local warehousing where the product comes in from a manufacturing location. You have to go through the entire process of receiving the product, putting it away, and when the demand for the product comes, you pack it again, in an insulated box through a packing solution, and then go out for last mile. So we had to plan for all the three. Now, how do you create a template for it? How do you create it in a modular way? So what the process is, you are able to formalize for one warehouse. Are you able to replicate it in an easier way? You do the knowledge transfer, you do the design transfer, everything. So that was the challenge. So just have a look at this, the scheme of things. So there's a plant, there's a primary distribution center. In a country like India, you'll definitely need more than one primary distribution center. Maybe one in the north, another in the south, definitely two. Then you can have a flow of material that goes directly from the distribution center to the corporate hospitals or the big government hospitals. But there is also an alternate flow that goes through a secondary distribution center. And then from the secondary distribution center, it goes through a vaccination site, a session site as it is called. But you could also be bypassing the secondary distribution center. So there are these lines which are all crisscrossing. Okay. So you have to manage all those flows. You really have to figure out what is the order quantity for which kind of a flow. Whether if this is going to be very frequent small orders that require very frequent replenishment, then of course you need to go through a secondary distribution center. But if you have the capability to store those vaccines, say 15 days worth of consumption, then you are in a good space. You're able to cube out. Your transportation is set. You'll do a full truck and send it directly to the corporate hospitals. So these are all the thought process that goes into supply chain planning or network design. Design your MOQ, design your inventory policy. Mind you, when you are talking of, say, holding 15 days of inventory or 10 days of inventory, then also you need to have those kind of cold chain infrastructure that can hold that inventory. So in our case, we're talking about a -20 cold chain infrastructure. So you have to do the sizing of the infrastructure. What is the size of the infrastructure you require at the primary distribution center? What is the size of the infrastructure you need to create on the secondary side? What is the frequency? What is the inventory holding policy? Similarly, what are your contracts with the hospitals? So these are all planning parameter discussions, and that is how we went around in designing the network. So I thought I'll just put together some thoughts about how to create a robust vaccine distribution network. What are the design elements for creating a vaccine distribution network in a large enough geography? And what could be the design principles? So one of the things is that, like I said earlier, you need to design a network which has a minimum number of touches. If you are able to reach directly to the people who need the vaccine, that is the best way to go. But if you cannot, then how do you minimize that touch? How do you minimize those touch points? First and foremost, you need a temperature controlled warehouse. Now you can have walk-in chambers, or you can have freezer farms. That is your choice, what you want to do it. Or you can convert a complete warehouse into a -20, -25 warehouse, which is what we did in Hyderabad. The other element of that puzzle is having cold chain validated boxes. These are boxes that work with phase change material. So you have to condition them for a minimum 24 hours and bring them to, say, a -30 degree centigrade. And that ensures that you are safe for the next 96 hours of transit you put your product in. In addition to that, you would also need active transportation solutions like reefer vans, because you might have created a box that has an internal environment of -20, but if you subject it to an external environment of +50, then the performance is going to deteriorate. Yeah. So if you want a performance of a box that is something you can believe in. Our recommendation was, and that what we have also planned is that you use a refrigerated van, maybe not a -20 van, but a 228 van that gives the ambient environment around the packing that you have created. Temperature control solutions conducive for air freight. We all know of those active solutions or the passive solutions that an air freight industry supports. One critical thing was medical grade freezers. So some people think, okay, a freezer is a freezer. I have even my freezer in my household can maintain -20 freezer compartment. So any freezer will do, but that's not the case. What you really need are medical grade freezers, and the difference over here is that the performance is qualified for those medical grade freezers, and is the uniformity in the temperature that it can maintain. And then there are other backup elements to it that a medical grade freezer has, and then you have to back it up with other processes that enable you to continuously monitor the temperature of the product, whether it is in storage or in transit. So for example, if there is power outage, you should get alerted. If there is a temperature excursion, you should get it alerted. You should have a response mechanism every time you get an alert. Security is another very important aspect. So geofencing, geopositioning, and a digital platform where you can capture all that data, and not to forget standard operating procedures and training of all personnel. So the knowledge transfer or the template that I talked about, the SOPs that you create, you have to ensure that any time you're adding a node to the network, the people who's going to handle your product, they are trained, and they ensure that the product reaches the people who need it in the correct, and the efficacy is maintained in an efficacious manner. So that is the landscape of vaccine distribution from a in-country distribution perspective. So that is the last piece of the puzzle, I think. So from the international border crossing and how do you get it all the way to the last mile, I think we've been able to discuss it today. So with that, that brings me to the end of my talk today. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mathur. And thank you to all the speakers for having shared their views and their insights on end-mile delivery of medical technologies, pharmaceutical products, and vaccines. I would like to now open the floor for questions and comments. We have received some in the chat box, and I will share them with you. We have a question focusing on least developed countries. It reads, most LDCs face huge infrastructure challenges. What measures could be put in place to help LDCs ensure the integrity of vaccines that require cold storage? I think this is a question that builds on Dr. Mathur's excellent presentation. Would you like to take it, Dr. Mathur? Or anyone else? Roy? Yeah? Yes, please, go ahead.
Yeah, so, there are no shortcuts here. So, when you say that the vaccine requires cold storage, then it requires cold storage. And we should not be trying to create processes that, that enable us to bypass what is required to ensure the integrity of the product. And so it would require, getting new assets created, getting new warehouses qualified. So, it has to be done in a planned way. That's what I can say. It requires investment, and it requires, to expand the network. That's what I would respond to the question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mathur. Would anybody else like to add something?
Thank you, Josefita. Perhaps just to add, from the trade point of view, there is really not much you can do, except, for example, for the country to facilitate the importation of this type of devices. So, for example, if you desperately need them, then perhaps it's not a good idea to levy high duties or high taxes on this type of products, because you want to actually incentivize and allow the companies or some other type of activities, or the air cargo freighters, or the express delivery type of companies, to be able to bring them as quickly as possible, right? Now, the good thing is many of the vaccine manufacturers are aware that this is an issue. Even initially, I think it was -70, some of the vaccines, which was incredibly difficult. Very few countries were able to maintain that. So there is also development by the vaccine manufacturers to try to, let's say, increase the temperature at which they can actually be stored and distributed. But this, of course, is not easy. It may take some time.
Thank you very much, Roy. I have another question actually here for Dr. Mathur. How would you propose to deal with the shortage of vaccines in India? What would you suggest to expedite access to vaccines? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think the obvious answer to that question, Josefita, is that you have to enhance the manufacturing capacity. So you need to qualify more sites, do the technology transfer of the manufacturing of that vaccine, add more and more plants, get more and more people to start manufacturing. Of course, you can rely on imports, but then when the demand is very high, it's better, adding local capacity to manufacture those vaccines. That is the only way. There is no easy answer to that question. We'll have to add more and more manufacturing capacity. That's the only thing we can do.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mathur. I have another question. I think this is addressed to all our speakers, and all of you could answer. What are the best practices and the successful solutions found during the past year? Would anybody like to take this? Yes, Roy, please.
Go ahead, Roy.
I think, sorry, Joe. Perhaps just to say best practices on what? Because if you saw the presentations, we have so many different areas here that intertwined, that go from trade policy, logistics, services, goods, customs type of issues. So I think there is a soul searching, let's say, taking place in many different areas, including at the WTO, where our members in the different areas are precisely doing this type of soul searching, try to identify what are some of the best practices. And then, for example, in the Committee on Trade Facilitation, one of the big questions, and I think Carlos put it in good terms, if you were able to facilitate and move quickly with respect to some of these measures, is it possible that perhaps we can do something quicker or faster to fully implement all the different types of measures? But then, of course, for the moment, these are still in discussions. And I think probably we'll need to take some time for the dust to settle down and be able to see more clearly what those lessons are.
If I may add to that, and this, again, Roy, you're absolutely right, best practices on what? But let me address perhaps best practices on trade facilitation. We've seen throughout our networks that countries that had implemented more and not less of the trade facilitation agreement measures were much more resilient. Those who had electronic customs, capacity to electronic advanced information on cargo, do risk processing remotely so that the cargo could be cleared, whether it was a vaccine or something else, it doesn't matter, before the physical arrival of the goods, rather than having the requirement of someone physically present to open a box, inspect it, require umpteen papers with rubber stamps and original signatures. So one of the lessons is accelerate the implementation of the trade facilitation agreement, get as close as possible the ideal picture that a full implementation of the TFA paints, because that will make you more resilient for future crises. For us, at least, this is a loud and clear lesson learned from the pandemic.
Yeah, if I can, I would add, have a strategy with your partners, so where you can consolidate your spend with some of the bigger players that have true global presence, and where you get the right attention from them. with the amount of spend and the business you do with them, with having deep partnerships. So that's one area of best practice and learning. The other one is really reevaluate the supply chain. So, how many nodes do you have? How many touches do you have in your network? Where are opportunities for you to kind of go direct and become more agile and resilient, automate your distribution centers to where you're not so reliant on labor. And then more importantly, test the processes. So, often too many times we put BCP on paper, but we're not salting and really testing those processes in practice to make sure they'll work. And think of the unknown as you run through those scenarios. We never would have thought of a global pandemic, but we need to be thinking like that, those types of unforeseen issues as we really think about our BCP and our agility and resiliency of the network. So.
Yeah, I like to add, just to add on to what Joe said on resilience. I think as organizations, what we also need to now learn is and develop the capability to create scenarios, to be able to visualize scenarios. Because the demands are disrupted, your supplies are also disrupted. So we really do not know what the flow is going to look like. So you could be planning for one scenario, but you end up living another scenario. So digitally, if you are able to create that ability to at least visualize multiple scenarios and have some sort of a estimate what the probability of each becoming real is, and what is the trade-off, what is the in terms of value. So then you will be able to take very educated and scientific bets as to what scenario to plan for, but also you have to back it up with your ability to execute it. Not just being aware of what a new demand scenario could be, but do you really have your supply chains lined up to meet that scenario? So it looks a little futuristic, but that is the way. There will not be a single supply plan or a single demand plan. The future organizations will be dealing with. I think organizations will be generating multiple scenarios and multiple demand plans and multiple supply plans, and also evaluating their own capabilities of executing each and every one of them in case they have to deal with it. So I thought I'll just add to what we discussed just right now.
Yeah, and what I want to add, I think I agree with all the previous speakers. I think I want to add what Roy said, best practice of what, but not just of what and by whom. I think is very important. We talk about the best practice, by enterprises, by business, but also there's another question, best practice by government, by policymakers. Okay, I think that is very important. For example, when we talk about resilience, to build resilience of supply chains, I think there's, of course, business, they are considering how to strengthen the resilience of supply chains, and even in the logistic of medical products. But I think also government they are also considering how to build resilience of the supply chain resilience. For example, now they are considering whether we should have a dual procurement source, local and abroad, and also try to balance make and buy. Okay, and also how to build in digitalization, automation in the logistic in the country. And also there's another consideration, like this kind of warehousing facility capacity, and this kind of stock and the inventory, and also all these kind of topics. They all should be built in the consideration of best practice.
Maybe just one more thing to add on policymakers, on what government do. What we've seen here at the WTO is that in all the different committees, that there's a focus on transparency. Many members have provided more information that is required by them in their notifications, and this has been really appreciated by the other members. And there's really a need for all those new policy measures that became available to create this transparency. Thanks.
Roy, would you like to take the floor again?
Sorry, Josefita. Yeah, just perhaps as people were talking, of course, I thought of a lot of other things, no? But there's just one that I would like to mention, and I would be interested to hear the opinion of Joe and Dr. Ravi. And this is the basically inverse relationship that you seem to have between the resilience and also the, let's say, efficiency of the network that you are trying to provide. Or if I put it more bluntly, you can be super sure that you're going to have everything you need, but then that's going to have a big cost. And then if you have a big cost, of course, it affects your efficiency. It affects also your competitivity vis-a-vis other companies. But then in terms of your experience, perhaps if you can share some of the lessons that you have learned in this respect.
Yeah, Roy, at least for us. So I think you can do both. So it's really optimizing reducing single points of failure, and then optimizing where you can leverage manufacturing and distribution centers with multiple capabilities and still get scale and still have resiliency. The other thing that we've done is we've developed a digital twin, and it actually truly is a digital representation of our supply chain. It's a partnership with Lamasoft. And it's early adopter technology, but it allows us to see our entire global network and run scenarios on total landed costs from ultimately supplier all the way through finished goods, field inventory, network modeling. And what we found is there's still a ton of opportunity to take costs out in our network and increase agility and resiliency without driving costs up. And ultimately we can self-fund in some areas, some of the resiliency we need to put in place, because in our world, at the end of the day, it's 100% service level at the OR. It's no question, right? It's less about money. It's more about delivering to the patient needs. So,
yeah, thank you. So Joe has summed it up pretty beautifully. And Roy, I think what you are trying to say is that resilience comes at a cost. But at the same time, like Joe said, that your service levels have to be 100%. So that looks like a contradiction. You need 100% service level, but at the same time, you want to build resilience. That's going to cost money. So how do the two converge? How do you manage the two? So what we do as a parallel exercise is while there are factors you cannot control, they are outside your scope, and they keep on chipping away at your effectiveness. But at the same time, what we do is we carry out a parallel exercise of looking at ideas where we could be, how we could reduce your total variable cost. Okay, because there would be some pool of, some products where you still have opportunities, and how do you get down your operating expenses? So unless you operate, and run very rigorous programs in an organization, and you keep you keep an eye on what your total variable cost is vis-a-vis what the baseline was next year, and run this program year on year, things could really spiral out of control. So while there are factors you cannot control, I think to have a pool of ideas, we are able to pull it back, either both on variable costs and on the operating expenses. That is somehow you are able to effectively manage the bottom line, and at the same time to try to be resilient. So that is one way I think organizations can respond to that challenge.
Thank you very much. Well, this has been a very interesting exchange. I think the closing note about building resilience and balance is also very important to keep in mind. And I'm sure that we could continue this discussion for a couple of hours more, and there's material to organize more webinars here. But we are already 7 minutes past 3 Geneva time, and we're coming towards the end of this webinar. I would like to thank our speakers for their generosity, for their time, and sharing with us their insights and experience of the last 14 months. I would like to thank participants for their engagement. And I hope that this is only the start of the conversation and that we will be in a position to build on what we learned today and continue trying to understand and finding solutions. Next week, next Wednesday, 2nd of June, we will host the 4th and last webinar of the 2021 Trade and Public Health series. It will focus on regulatory cooperation, one of the key factors to ensure access to medical technologies. We hope to see you all there. Thank you very much for being with us today. Stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you very
everyone.
much.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.